Imagine watching a documentary so disturbing that millions of viewers admitted they couldn't finish it. A story not of fiction, but of reality, raw, unfiltered, and too dark for television. Tonight, we uncover the case Netflix tried to tell, but many wish they hadn't pressed play. Chapter 1. When entertainment crosses a line. Imagine sitting down on a Friday night, ready to watch something gripping on Netflix. You expect mystery, drama, maybe even a little shock, but what you find is different. Within minutes, you feel uneasy. By the halfway mark, you realize you can't continue. Your hands reach for the remote, not because you're bored, but because the story is too heavy. This is not just entertainment anymore. It feels like staring into something you were never meant to see. That was the experience of thousands of viewers when a certain Netflix documentary first premiered. It was promoted like many other true crime features, a deep dive into a real case, offering insight, details, and answers. But what followed was something else entirely. Within hours, online forums filled with comments like "I had to stop watching, this made me sick to my stomach, and why did they release something so disturbing?" True crime has always had a dark attraction. People are drawn to it the way they are drawn to haunted houses or horror films. There's safety in watching someone else's nightmare from the comfort of your living room. But sometimes, a story doesn't stay contained on the screen. Sometimes, the darkness is too raw, too real, and it seeps into your thoughts long after the credits roll. Netflix has built a reputation for true crime. From making a murderer to "Don't F***K with cats," the platform knows how to grip an audience. But this particular documentary crossed an invisible line. It wasn't just about shock. It was about pain, unfiltered, relentless, and hard to turn away from. The case it covered was already infamous. Newspapers had reported it, news anchors had whispered about it, and people had debated it in living rooms for years. But Netflix didn't just report the facts. They showed details many thought should have stayed in case files, behind closed doors. They presented interviews that shook viewers, testimony that felt more like confessions from a nightmare than a documentary segment. And the reaction was immediate. Social media exploded. On Twitter, people begged friends not to watch past the first episode. On Reddit, threads debated whether Netflix had gone too far. On TikTok, reaction clips showed people breaking down in real time as they tried to continue. Why was it so disturbing? That question haunted both viewers and critics. After all, true crime is nothing new. Gruesome cases have been covered before, some even with graphic detail. But there was something about this production, something in the way it was framed, that made it unbearable. Some said it was the pacing. Instead of easing viewers in, the documentary dropped them straight into the darkest details. Others pointed to the raw interviews, where voices cracked and eyes broke down in front of the camera. A few suggested it wasn't even the content itself, but the unflinching way Netflix refused to let the audience look away. It wasn't entertainment anymore. It was exposure. Exposure to human cruelty, to broken systems, and to suffering most people would rather pretend doesn't exist. Think of television history. There have always been dark moments. A live broadcast gone wrong. A news anchor forced to break horrifying news. A tragedy unfolding in real time. But those moments weren't meant to entertain. They were accidents of reality. What made this documentary stand apart was intention. Someone chose to edit it this way. Someone chose to release it worldwide, knowing the weight it carried. That decision became the heart of the debate. Was it ethical? Was it necessary? Did Netflix shed light on a case that needed attention, or did they exploit trauma for streaming numbers? Critics split sharply. Some argued it was important, necessary, even they said the truth should never be softened. They believed viewers needed to see the darkness to truly understand what happened. Others saw it as reckless. They said the producers forgot about the families involved, the survivors who might be traumatized, and the audience who expected a documentary but received something closer to psychological punishment. But beyond critics, the everyday viewers told the real story, and their voices painted one picture. This documentary didn't just shock, it wounded. Parents confessed they couldn't sleep after watching it. College students admitted they felt unsafe walking home at night. Even seasoned true crime fans, people used to violent stories, admitted this one crossed a threshold. This raises the question we must carry through this story. When does documenting the truth stop being journalism and start becoming harm? Because Netflix didn't break any rules. They didn't fabricate anything. They didn't add gore or special effects. They simply showed the case as it was, yet somehow, that truth was darker than fiction. It's worth remembering that Netflix is not a news outlet. It's a streaming service designed to entertain, to keep you watching. The algorithms push the shocking, the dramatic, the unforgettable. And in that pursuit, this documentary may have gone too far. Entertainment has always walked a fine line with real tragedy. Movies based on true events dramatize pain for profit. Television specials stretch stories into cliffhangers. But a global platform like Netflix raises the stakes. Millions see what once might have stayed local. Trauma becomes international, broadcast into homes where no one was prepared for it. And that's what happened here. A story too disturbing for television became one of Netflix's most talked about releases, not because of praise, but because of fear. So what exactly was the story? Who were the people behind this darkness? And why did their tragedy echo louder than any fictional horror? That is where we go next. Into the real-life case. Into the nightmare that forced thousands of viewers to look away, but that we must now confront head-on. Because to understand why this documentary was too disturbing to finish, we first have to face the reality it was built on. The answer lies in the nature of true crime itself. For decades, television has told stories of killers, kidnappers, and tragedies. But Junko's case stood apart. It was not just a murder. It was prolonged, calculated suffering. It forced audiences to ask the darkest of questions. How could teenagers, barely older than the victim herself, commit such acts without remorse? Witnesses from the trial, some still haunted decades later, spoke on camera. Former investigators described the day they found her remains. Neighbors admitted the guilt of ignoring warning signs. Piece by piece, Netflix reconstructed the nightmare not with gore, but with testimony, police evidence, and chilling still photographs. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Because for viewers, the story was not just about Junko. It was about what people are capable of when conscience disappears. It was about the failure of systems to protect the vulnerable. And it was about the terrifying truth that this happened not in a war zone, not in a remote corner of history, but in an ordinary suburban home, under the noses of parents and neighbors. By the time the credits rolled, those who managed to finish the documentary were left with heavy silence. For many, it was unwatchable, but for those who endured, the question remained, how could something this dark have happened in real life? That is the real-life case behind the Netflix documentary, a story that still chills investigators, still haunts families, and now, thanks to streaming, has entered the collective memory of millions. And yet, as disturbing as this story was on its own, Netflix went further. The next chapter explores how the documentary was made, the choices behind the camera, the ethical questions raised, and why so many believe the filmmakers pushed the line of decency too far. Chapter 3. Filming the Darkness. When Netflix decided to adapt Junko Furuta's case, the choice was met with silence inside the production team. Everyone knew the story, everyone understood its weight, and everyone also knew that if they told it the wrong way, the documentary would either collapse into sensationalism or bury the truth beneath layers of censorship. From the beginning, the producers faced a dilemma. How much should be shown? The facts of the case were already public. Court records, trial testimonies, and old newspaper articles documented the 44 days of captivity. But there is a difference between reading words on a page and hearing survivors recount them on screen. One feels distant, the other feels immediate, raw, impossible to ignore. That immediacy was exactly what Netflix wanted. In meetings, producers argued that sanitizing the story would weaken its impact. Viewers, they said, deserved to see the truth unfiltered. If people looked away, so be it. But they would at least confront reality before turning off the screen. Still, others on the team hesitated. A few editors worried that re-traumatizing audiences wasn't the same as educating them. One producer reportedly asked, "Are we showing this because it matters, or because shock sells?" The decision was made to walk a fine line. The documentary would avoid graphic reenactments. There would be no staged violence, no gratuitous imagery, but it would lean heavily on first-hand testimony, voices of former detectives, neighbors, and even classmates of Junko. Their words, delivered without filters, carried the weight of horror more effectively than any dramatization could. During filming, the crew faced moments where they struggled to continue. One cameraman later said in an interview that holding the camera steady during survivor testimony was one of the hardest things he had ever done. Not because of technical challenges, but because he felt his hands shaking. Detectives, decades after the crime, broke down on screen. Their voices trembled as they described the discovery of Junko's remains. Some paused mid-sentence, unable to finish. The crew debated whether to cut those silences. In the end, they left them in. Those pauses became part of the documentary's haunting rhythm. Even in the editing room, the struggle continued. Raw interviews were painful to watch, sometimes lasting hours. Editors debated how much to keep. Every cut meant deciding between clarity and sensitivity. Should the audience hear a detective choke back tears? Should they watch a neighbor admit they ignored the screams next door? Was this honesty, or was it cruelty? Ultimately, the team chose honesty over comfort. They trimmed only for length, not for emotion. They let testimonies breathe, even if they dragged viewers into places no one wanted to go. This creative choice gave the documentary its disturbing power. It was not violent imagery that shook people, it was the sound of real voices reliving real horror. To reinforce authenticity, the production also leaned on police records. Court documents were displayed on screen, pages highlighted with key lines, handwritten notes from investigators appeared, often with shaky pen strokes that revealed the pressure of the time. Mugshots of the perpetrators, blurred at first and then revealed, reminded viewers these were not monsters from a film. They were teenagers, almost children themselves. The contrast was chilling. Compared to other Netflix true crime hits, this approach went further. Take Making a Murderer. That series leaned on legal drama questions of evidence, corruption, and trial procedure. It invited debate. Don't F***K with Cats mixed internet culture with crime investigation, creating a puzzle for viewers to solve. Both were gripping, but they maintained a level of distance. This documentary broke that distance. There was no puzzle, no debate about guilt. The perpetrators had confessed. The courts had ruled. What was left was the raw suffering of the victim, played back in detail the world could barely absorb. That is why it felt so different. Other true crime shows gave audiences the illusion of control. You could analyze, speculate, argue. Here, there was nothing to argue. No what if. Just a simple, heavy truth. This happened, and it was far worse than most people realized. Ethicists were quick to comment. Some praised the film for confronting society with its darkest realities. Others criticized it as voyeurism dressed in journalistic clothing. They asked whether Netflix was truly honoring Junko's memory, or whether they were packaging her suffering for global consumption. Inside the production, those questions never fully went away. Several staff members admitted later that they had nightmares during editing. Some left the project entirely, unable to continue. One assistant editor said she kept hearing Junko's name in her sleep, but Netflix executives believed the gamble was worth it. They argued that hiding the story was another form of injustice. If the world turned away because it was uncomfortable, the tragedy would fade into obscurity. By showing it, they said, they were ensuring it would never be forgotten. The result was a film that felt less like entertainment and more like evidence. Long takes, heavy silences, blurred photographs that lingered just a moment too long. It was not easy to watch, and that was the point. When the documentary premiered, the team braced for backlash. They expected criticism, maybe even boycotts. What they didn't expect was the overwhelming reaction of ordinary viewers. People weren't just angry, they were shaken. Many admitted they turned it off halfway, unable to continue. Others watched to the end but said they felt hollow afterward, as if they had witnessed something forbidden. And in that reaction, the filmmakers saw proof of their success. They had captured the truth in its purest form, not polished, not softened. A truth so heavy, it broke the audience in half. But success came with a cost. The backlash wasn't just noise. Critics accused Netflix of exploiting trauma. Survivors' advocacy groups questioned whether the documentary risked re-traumatizing Junko's family. Even some viewers asked if they had been harmed by watching it. The debate continues today. Did Netflix cross the line, or did they reveal the line we all prefer not to see? What is certain is this: by refusing to flinch, the filmmakers created one of the most disturbing documentaries in streaming history. It set a new benchmark for what real means in entertainment. And yet, the ripple effects weren't limited to critics or Netflix executives. They spread to millions of ordinary viewers. In the next chapter, we explore that reaction, not the crew, not the producers, but the audience. People who pressed play on a Friday night and found themselves pulled into darkness they couldn't escape. Chapter 4. Viewer Reactions. A collective breakdown when the documentary finally hit Netflix. Few were ready for what they saw. The story had been known in crime circles for decades. Yet the raw presentation of the film pushed audiences into territory they had never experienced before. What followed was not just conversation, it was a global breakdown, a collective moment where viewers admitted that the weight of the story was almost too much to carry. Across social media, the first wave of comments sounded the same. "I couldn't finish it." People described turning it off after 30 minutes, some after only 10. Others wrote that they forced themselves to watch to the end, but when the credits rolled, they sat in silence, unable to move. Nightmares became a common thread. On TikTok, users shared clips of themselves waking up in the middle of the night, shaken by dreams they couldn't explain. Reddit threads filled with confessions of panic attacks, trembling hands, and people pacing their rooms, trying to shake off the feeling that they had invited something heavy into their minds. One post on Reddit stood out. A user explained that they had watched countless horror films and documentaries without flinching, but this time was different. After one episode, they dreamed of hearing muffled screams through their walls. For weeks, they avoided watching anything after dark. "I thought I was numb," they wrote, "but this broke through." Others described something more subtle, a lingering sense of guilt. They questioned themselves. Why had they pressed play? Why did they need to see suffering packaged as content? Viewers admitted feeling complicit, as if by streaming the documentary, they were participating in the very exploitation they were condemning. At the same time, not everyone reacted with fear. Some spoke of being changed. A young woman in Canada posted a video explaining that after watching, she decided to volunteer at a local crisis center. She said she could no longer stand the thought of ignoring suffering in her own community. Another viewer in the UK admitted the documentary pushed him to reconnect with his younger sister, realizing how fragile safety can be. These case studies show the strange duality of the film's impact. It traumatized some but awakened others. It destroyed peace of mind for many, but for a smaller group, it planted seeds of action. The online response turned viral. On TikTok, clips with the hashtag Netflix documentary gained millions of views within days. Creators filmed their own faces while watching, capturing reactions in real time, covering their mouths, shaking their heads, even crying. These reaction videos became a trend, almost like a digital ritual of processing collective trauma together. On YouTube, entire channels dedicated to true crime posted breakdowns of the film. Some creators analyzed its editing, praising the decision to leave long silences. Others accused Netflix of manipulation, arguing that the documentary's strength came not from truth, but from carefully engineered discomfort. Viewers debated endlessly in the comments. Was this journalism, art, or exploitation? Reddit became the core of deeper conversation. Subreddits like r, True Crime, and r, Netflix filled with long threads, where users compared their own reactions. Some argued that the documentary was necessary, that by feeling discomfort, the world was forced to confront its darkest realities. Others countered that it crossed a moral boundary, turning suffering into a spectacle. The split was sharp. Even mainstream media picked up the story. Articles appeared in major outlets describing the film as the documentary too disturbing to finish. Psychologists were quoted, warning that exposure to extreme real-life trauma can trigger anxiety. Similar to PTSD, a few therapists wrote op-eds advising viewers to avoid the film altogether, especially those with a history of trauma or anxiety. And yet, the controversy only fueled the documentary's reach. Every warning, every post about people unable to sleep, became free promotion. Curiosity spread. People who might never have heard of the case clicked play just to see what the noise was about. The reactions weren't just emotional, they were physical. A TikTok trend emerged where users filmed themselves shaking, sweating, or covering their eyes. Some claimed they paused multiple times to breathe. The line between genuine suffering and performance blurred, but the pattern was undeniable. The film provoked visceral responses no scripted horror could match. But the most haunting reactions came from those who saw echoes of their own lives. A survivor of domestic abuse wrote that parts of the documentary mirrored memories she had buried for years. Watching, she said, felt like reliving. Another viewer, who had once been bullied as a teenager, admitted he had to pause during segments describing the perpetrator's casual cruelty. "It wasn't just a story anymore," he said. "It was me." These deeply personal reactions highlight why the documentary became more than entertainment. It acted as a mirror, reflecting back not only the cruelty of one crime, but the hidden scars people carry quietly. Yet the ethical question persisted. Critics asked, if millions of viewers are traumatized, if survivors are triggered, if people walk away damaged, can the project still be defended as art or truth? Or does that mean it has crossed into exploitation? Supporters argued that the discomfort was the point, that true crime should never be easy to consume, that if a story makes you sick, it means you've confronted something real. They pointed to history, noting that atrocities are often forgotten because they are too painful to revisit. By making people feel, even at great cost, the film was keeping memory alive. Skeptics disagreed. They pointed to the marketing campaign, to Netflix's global push for viewership, to the fact that every stream generated profit. They asked whether honoring a victim's memory should ever involve entertainment algorithms and trending hashtags. One columnist wrote, "When grief is monetized, what are we really watching? Truth or a product?" The debate raged on, and in many ways, it never ended. The documentary left a scar not just on viewers, but on the cultural conversation around true crime itself. It blurred the line between awareness and voyeurism, between education and spectacle. Perhaps the most chilling outcome was this: people couldn't stop talking about it. Even those who hated it, even those who claimed it should never have been made, kept returning to the subject. They posted, they debated, they warned others, and in doing so, they kept the film alive. In the end, the reaction became part of the story. The documentary wasn't just about a crime anymore. It was about what happens when millions of strangers around the world are forced to look at cruelty without flinching. For some, it was art. For others, it was exploitation. But for everyone, it was unforgettable. And as the world argued, Netflix quietly measured the numbers. One of their most talked about releases of the year. The next chapter examines that very controversy, the backlash, not just from audiences, but from critics, activists, and even the victim's family. The debate shifted from living rooms to courtrooms, from online comments to public statements. The question became louder: should this documentary have been made at all? Chapter 5. What wasn't shown. Every documentary leaves something out. No matter how raw it feels, what we see is always a version of reality-shaped cut, edited for the audience. The Netflix project was no different. Viewers often felt like they were seeing everything, that nothing had been softened. But behind the final cut, there were choices, and those choices raised some of the darkest questions of all. From the moment the film premiered, rumors began circulating about missing footage. Online forums filled with whispers. Was this really the full story? If this was what Netflix allowed us to see, what had been left behind in the editing room? A handful of insiders spoke, never officially, never on record, but enough to fuel speculation. They suggested that entire testimonies were cut, accounts too graphic or unsettling to be released. Some claimed there were interviews with neighbors who described details too disturbing to fit into mainstream media. Others hinted at footage of investigators breaking down during interviews, unable to hold back emotions. The producers never confirmed these rumors, but silence only made them louder. For many, the absence of certain voices felt intentional. Families of victims, for example, were shown in fragments, short quotes, brief appearances. Viewers asked, were they saying more than what was included? Was their grief considered too much for television? What wasn't shown became just as haunting as what was. People began speculating that the uncut version of the film was darker than anyone could imagine. Some even wondered if Netflix itself had drawn a line, fearing backlash if they revealed everything. This raises the central dilemma: where exactly should that line be drawn? If a documentary promises truth, does withholding parts of it betray the audience? Or is protecting viewers from extreme trauma the responsible choice? Media experts weighed in. Some argued that omission was not censorship but compassion. Dr. Ellen Hayes, a media psychologist, explained in one interview, "The brain processes real-life violence differently than fiction. Overexposure doesn't teach empathy, it can actually desensitize people or trigger psychological harm. Choosing to withhold certain content is not about hiding the truth. It's about protecting the mind from breaking under the weight of it." Others disagreed. For critics, leaving things out meant sanitizing history. True crime, they argued, is not meant to be comfortable. If the real case was unbearable, then so be it. Hiding parts of it risks making the past seem lighter, safer than it really was. One columnist put it bluntly, "If we turn away, even in editing, we risk forgetting what we should never forget." The clash between these two positions is not new. Television history is filled with examples of darkest moments where producers faced the same dilemma. In the 1960s, coverage of war was heavily filtered. Graphic images rarely reached the public. By contrast, during later conflicts, raw footage shocked viewers into protest. The lesson was clear. What we see or don't see shapes how we react. The Netflix documentary sits within this same debate. By releasing a cut that was already unbearable for many, the producers forced society to ask, if this is the version they allowed, how much worse was the full story? Whispers about the missing footage became a story of its own. Some online claimed that there were recordings of investigators describing personal nightmares after reviewing evidence. Others believed there were scenes showing the crime scene in greater detail, too unsettling for broadcast. None of this was ever proven, but the power of rumor was undeniable. In a strange way, what wasn't shown only deepened the impact. The imagination often fills gaps with images worse than anything real. Viewers began creating their own versions of the missing scenes, haunted by possibilities. The unknown became a kind of ghost, following the documentary long after the credits rolled. Still, some journalists pushed for transparency. They argued that if certain testimonies were cut, Netflix should release transcripts words without visuals, at least. Others suggested a restricted version for researchers, separate from general streaming audiences. Netflix never responded to these requests. The mystery of the missing footage remained locked behind editing decisions. And this leads to a larger question. Does exposing horror educate, or does it traumatize? Supporters of exposure argue that people must confront the worst of humanity to learn from it. Shielding society, they say, only allows history to repeat. They point to documentaries about genocide or war crimes that shocked the world into awareness. Without the raw images, would people have cared enough to act? On the other hand, trauma experts warn that mass audiences are not courts or historians. They are ordinary people watching at home, sometimes children, sometimes those already carrying scars. To them, broadcasting the rawest truth is not education, but harm. Trauma spreads like fire, and once an image burns into the mind, it cannot be undone. The Netflix case embodies this paradox. Millions pressed play expecting to learn, but many walked away damaged. And if the cut version already broke people, what would the uncut version have done? Some experts argue this is exactly why certain lines must exist. True crime, they say, cannot show everything. To do so would risk crossing from journalism into voyeurism, offering not truth, but spectacle. Others counter that, holding back risks erasing victims' suffering, making it easier for viewers to look away. It is here that history echoes again. From live broadcasts of tragedies to sensational TV coverage of disasters, each generation has wrestled with the same boundary. The darkest TV moments always force us to ask, are we learning or are we consuming? The Netflix documentary stands in this lineage. Its missing pieces remind us that truth is never whole when filtered through a screen. We are always watching a version of story stitched together by what producers believe we can bear. And sometimes, the cuts are as telling as the footage itself. In the end, what wasn't shown may haunt us more than what was. The The gaps whisper louder than the images. The rumors of darker testimonies leave questions that may never be answered. And perhaps that's the most chilling truth. We will never know if the worst parts were left unseen, or if the documentary itself was already the limit of what could be endured. What was cut, and why, may remain forever hidden. But its absence is part of the legacy. The documentary is not just about a crime. It is about the choices we make in telling it and the shadows that editing leaves behind. As we move to the final chapter, one question remains. What does this mean for us, as viewers? If we continue to demand darker, more disturbing stories, where does the line break? And when it does, will we still be able to tell the difference between truth and spectacle? Chapter 6. The line we shouldn't cross. Why do we keep pressing play? That's the question at the heart of every disturbing documentary. Despite the discomfort, despite the nightmares, millions still chose to sit through the Netflix film. Some stopped halfway, but many pushed on, and even those who turned it off couldn't stop thinking about it. There is something about true crime, especially stories this dark, that pulls us in. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon for years. Humans are drawn to danger, even when it's only on a screen. Watching crime, we feel both fear and safety. Fear, because the events are real, and safety because we are not the ones living through them. This strange balance creates a rush, a mix of dread and curiosity that can feel almost addictive. But the Netflix case proved that curiosity has limits. Viewers didn't just watch, they suffered. Anxiety, guilt, sleepless nights. This wasn't entertainment in the usual sense. It became something heavier, almost ritualistic, like staring into the abyss and daring it to stare back. So why do we do it? For some, it's about preparation. People say that by learning about crime, they feel more alert, more aware of danger in their own lives. For others, it's about empathy, the belief that by listening to victims' stories, they honor their pain. And for many, it's about seeking answers. We want to understand the unthinkable, to make sense of cruelty that seems beyond reason. But here lies the danger. In chasing answers, we can cross into voyeurism. When suffering becomes content, when tragedy becomes a product, the line between truth and spectacle begins to blur. The Netflix documentary forced this question into the open. Was it helping society confront evil, or was it feeding our darkest curiosity? Supporters argued that it held up a mirror, forcing us to see the reality we often ignore. Critics countered that it turned victims into characters, their pain into scenes edited for impact. Both sides had a point. What we must ask is, at what cost? The lesson of this case is not just about one film, it's about us, about the way we consume stories of real suffering. Media companies know that darker content attracts attention. They measure clicks, streams, watch times. If people keep demanding darker, producers will keep supplying it. And if no boundary is set, we may one day watch things that should never have been filmed at all. Morality becomes fragile here. On one hand, telling the truth is essential. Hiding the darkest parts of history risks forgetting them. But on the other, there is a human cost. Every story shown has survivors, families, communities still carrying scars. To them, the documentary is not just content, it is reopening a wound. That is the ethical line, the space where truth collides with respect, where awareness risks becoming exploitation. Looking back at television history, this is not new. The darkest moments always reveal the same pattern. A shocking broadcast grabs attention, then sparks outrage, then forces reflection. The Netflix film simply became the latest example in a long chain of media moments that made us ask, how much is too much? But perhaps what makes this case stand apart is the intimacy of streaming. People weren't watching in theaters or public screenings. They were alone, at night, headphones on, lights off. The horror reached them in the most private spaces of their lives. That closeness may explain why it felt unbearable, because the story was not just on the screen, it was in the room. So where do we go from here? One answer is balance. Documentaries must remain truthful but thoughtful. revealing without destroying. Audiences must learn to recognize their limits, to turn away when watching crosses into harm. And platforms must question not only what people will watch, but what they should. This doesn't mean abandoning true crime. Stories of darkness are part of human history, and ignoring them serves no one. But it does mean asking why we watch. Are we seeking understanding, or are we seeking thrills? Are we honoring victims, or are we consuming them? The Netflix case holds a mirror to us, as much as to the crime it depicts. It shows that we are fascinated by the abyss, but also vulnerable to it. That curiosity can inform us, but it can also wound us. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the line we shouldn't cross is one we often don't see until it's too late. In the end, the question lingers: if reality itself is this disturbing, do we dare to keep watching? Some will say yes because turning away feels like denial. Others will say no because protecting the mind is as important as learning the truth. Neither answer is simple, but maybe that's the point. The darkness of human nature cannot be reduced to entertainment or education. It is both and it is neither. As the credits of this story roll, we are left not with closure but with unease, the kind that stays with you long after the screen goes dark, the kind that makes you wonder what tomorrow's documentary will dare to show. And when it does, will we press play again? This was one of the darkest truths streaming has ever shown us. But what do you think? Should stories this disturbing even be told? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to keep exploring the shadows of reality with us, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the Dark Truths community.